Collapse never starts with fire, it starts with delay. A late delivery, a missed repair, a system that still exists on paper but no longer synchronizes in real life. While people argue about politics, markets, or news cycles, the underlying machinery quietly loses timing. You don't hear the snap when it breaks, you feel the drag. And by the time most people notice, they are already reacting instead of positioning. Failures don't arrive evenly. They arrive spatially. One county loses pressure while the next still showers. One grid segment flickers while another streams video. This unevenness tricks people into thinking the system is stable. It isn't. It's desynchronizing. And desynchronization is the most dangerous phase because it preserves hope while destroying coordination. You are already inside a binary, whether you acknowledge it or not. Panic versus analysis. Panic focuses on events. Analysis tracks structure. Panic asks, what just happened? Analysis asks, where does stress accumulate next? Most people wait for visible damage. By then, the invisible damage has already locked in the outcome. The first thing that survives is geography. The first thing that dies is coordination. Coordination is expensive. It requires timing, trust, staffing, energy, and uninterrupted communication. Geography requires nothing. It just sits there, shaping outcomes without debate. Mountains don't negotiate. Distance doesn't care about plans. Climate doesn't respond to effort. People like to believe survival is about preparation. Stockpiles, skills, tools, those matter later. Early on, survival is about where stress concentrates fastest. Density concentrates stress. Dependency multiplies it. When millions of people rely on tightly synchronized systems to remain calm, time shrinks brutally. One missed handoff cascades into 10 secondary failures, then 100. Cities don't collapse because they are immoral, decadent, or poorly run. They collapse because they require constant alignment. Traffic signals must agree with each other. Pumps must agree with sensors. Software must agree with inventories. Human schedules must agree with machine schedules. When alignment degrades, nothing dramatic happens at first. Just friction, then delays, then improvisation. That's where the system tears. Low-density regions don't succeed because they are tougher or smarter. They succeed because they ask less of reality. Fewer moving parts means fewer assumptions. Fewer assumptions mean fewer surprises. When systems degrade, boring places remain boring. They don't need to be heroic. They just need to avoid complexity debt. Energy exposes the illusion faster than anything else. People confuse abundance with safety. They see megawatts and assume resilience. But abundance depends on transport, staffing, maintenance, and uninterrupted control. Independence doesn't. Power generated close to where it's used doesn't care about long transmission chains or perfect staffing. It keeps working not because it's advanced, but because it's neglected successfully. This is where popular narratives fail. People imagine collapse as a switch flipping off. In reality, it's a dimmer sliding slowly downward. Power still exists, but not everywhere. Not reliably, not predictably. And predictability is what keeps behavior stable. Once predictability erodes, people begin making defensive choices that accelerate load elsewhere. Climate doesn't cause collapse. It compresses timelines. Extreme heat, floods, wildfire seasons. Each one consumes recovery capacity. Systems can absorb shocks when there's time between them. Remove the time and resilience becomes irrelevant. States with boring, predictable weather don't attract attention. They attract survival windows. This chapter is not about winners. It's about elimination. Collapse removes options quietly before people notice they're gone. By the time panic spreads, geography has already sorted outcomes. Some regions still function not because they're better, but because fewer systems have to cooperate for a normal day to exist. Most states don't fail dramatically. They fail by asking too much, too fast, from infrastructure that was already stretched thin. Services don't disappear, they degrade. And degradation is harder to respond to than catastrophe because it invites denial. Once coordination drops below a threshold, the map takes over. Not opinions, not effort, not optimism, just physics, load, and distance deciding how long a place can pretend it's still normal. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see where the survivors are watching from. And hit subscribe while you're here. As pressure builds, you don't see people move toward resilience. You see them move toward familiarity. Stress narrows perception, and under narrowing, the brain looks for signals that say this is still normal. That instinct made sense in stable eras. In collapse, it becomes a trap. Jobs, growth, culture, innovation, these are not neutral indicators. They are comfort signals. They tell you where systems used to work efficiently, not where they can survive dysfunction. People don't chase safety. They chase continuity of identity. They want to believe life will resume with minimal adjustment, and they move toward places that promise that illusion. This creates the next binary you can't avoid: appearance versus function. Appearance is what looks advanced, connected, and dynamic. Function is what keeps operating when coordination decays. These two drift apart long before collapse becomes visible. States that look advanced are usually the most fragile because they export complexity. They rely on deep specialization, long supply chains, just-in-time inventory, and constant data synchronization. Each layer adds efficiency and fragility. When one link slows, the shock doesn't stay local. It amplifies. Systems optimized for speed react badly to friction. Food exposes this faster than any other system. Grocery stores feel abundant because shelves are full, lights are on, and transactions are smooth. But those shelves are clocks, not stockpiles. They measure timing precision. When distribution slows, nothing collapses immediately. Instead, gaps appear. First, brands vanish, then categories, then predictability itself. You have roughly 72 hours after disruption before behavior shifts. Not because people suddenly become violent, but because hunger rewrites priorities. Moral reasoning compresses into arithmetic. How much is left? How long it lasts? Who gets access? States that keep functioning don't have more food. They have shorter paths between production and consumption. Distribution light systems matter more than abundance. Calories that move through 2 steps instead of 7 encounter fewer failure points. Each removed jurisdiction, warehouse, and scheduling layer reduces friction. Friction is the silent killer of logistics. Reduce friction and systems bend instead of snapping. Federal dependency deepens the mistake. People assume visibility brings protection. In reality, visibility brings delay. States tightly integrated into centralized response frameworks wait for alignment, legal, political, administrative, before acting. Aid arrives late, fragmented, and conditional. Not because anyone is malicious, but because scale requires procedure. Here's what nobody tells you. Centralized rescue slows adaptation. Decisions stack up. Authority diffuses. Local improvisation gets overridden by protocol. States accustomed to solving problems internally adapt faster because they don't expect permission. They act, adjust, and move on. Less attention means fewer resources, but also fewer bottlenecks. When you don't expect rescue, you don't wait for it. That mindset preserves momentum. Momentum preserves function. Water ends the debate completely. You can substitute food sources. You can reduce energy usage. You cannot improvise water at scale. Water moves according to gravity, geography, and containment. Either you control it locally or you negotiate for it endlessly. Aquifers, snowpack, and self-contained watersheds survive politics. They ignore promises. They outlast budgets. States that remain functional aren't richer. They're upstream, physically and structurally. They don't need permission to drink. Most people never evaluate where their water comes from. They see faucets, not flow. This blindness persists until restriction appears. By then, options have narrowed to compliance or flight. Movement is the final illusion. People believe they can relocate once risk becomes obvious. But by the time the threat feels undeniable, movement is already constrained. Roads saturate. Fuel access fragments. Informal rationing emerges through pricing, availability, and social pressure. No announcement marks the closing window. There's no alarm. One day, travel simply costs more in time, money, and uncertainty than people can pay. Those who waited for certainty discover that certainty never comes. Only gradients do. Most people don't choose where to live based on flow, friction, or failure tolerance. They choose based on comfort. That mistake doesn't punish immediately. It compounds quietly until the math flips and relocation stops being a strategy. And when that happens, you don't end up where you want to be. You end up where you already are. Now the picture sharpens, not emotionally, but structurally. Once you stop asking which states are best and start asking which ones fail last, the noise disappears. Rankings, opinions, and lifestyle arguments collapse into irrelevance. What remains is pattern recognition. Survival is not a reward for virtue. It's an outcome of friction, neglect, and inconvenient geography. This is not about strong states outperforming weak ones. It's about places that are hard to stress all at once. The core rule beneath everything is simple and unforgiving. Survival favors places that can be ignored. Not admired, not optimized. Not constantly used as engines of growth. Ignorability is insulation. The states that keep functioning share traits no one markets. Distance, cold, limited access, sparse infrastructure, low population churn. These qualities don't repel people intentionally. They repel pressure. When demand surges elsewhere, these places absorb it slowly or not at all. That delay is survival time. Friction is the mechanism. Friction slows movement, decision-making, and crowd behavior. It introduces cost where panic wants speed. Panic thrives on immediacy. Friction forces hesitation. Hesitation prevents stampedes. And stampedes are what overload systems faster than any physical failure. Places that are hard to reach don't fill up overnight. That matters more than people realize. Migration under stress doesn't distribute evenly. It spikes. Everyone tries to move at once toward the same signals. When geography resists that spike, pressure stays spread out instead of concentrating catastrophically. Every mile that costs fuel, weather risk, time, and attention filters out impulsive movement. That filter isn't moral, it's mechanical. Fewer arrivals mean lower demand shocks. Lower demand shocks mean infrastructure bends instead of breaking. This is how friction quietly saves systems. These states also share another uncelebrated trait. They never fully optimized. Their grids are older, their cities are smaller. Their logistics loops are regional instead of national. Nothing runs at theoretical peak efficiency. That inefficiency leaves slack, and slack is what absorbs shock when coordination degrades. Optimization removes redundancy. Redundancy looks wasteful during growth and priceless during stress. When systems are pushed to maximum efficiency, they lose tolerance for error. When they're under-optimized, they survive mistakes. Mistakes are inevitable during collapse. Tolerance determines outcomes. This carries into social behavior as well. Smaller, more stable populations don't depend on trust to function. They depend on predictability. Fewer strangers mean fewer unknown variables. Lower churn means norms persist longer. Rumors spread slower. Behavioral cascades take more time to form. People misunderstand this and assume survival requires strong social bonds. It doesn't. It requires behavioral continuity. People don't need to like each other. They need routines that don't collapse under stress. Predictability keeps systems intact long after goodwill fades. This is the difference between disruption and unraveling. Disruption is a shock the system absorbs. Unraveling is when behavior itself becomes the stressor. States with stable, slow-changing populations resist unraveling because the social fabric doesn't reconfigure overnight. That's why the same names appear repeatedly without romance or hype. Alaska, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, Maine. Not because they're perfect, because they're inconvenient. They sit outside major transit corridors. They carry energy locally. They control water regionally. Cold enforces discipline. Space limits density. Isolation reduces load. Energy surplus reduces dependency. Water control eliminates negotiation. Cold compresses behavior into planning. Space prevents pressure spikes. None of these make life easy. All of them make collapse slower. This isn't advice, it's observation. A reading of the map after removing fantasy and preference. Maps don't argue. They don't persuade. They don't care what you want. They describe constraints and outcomes. And once you understand the pattern, comfort stops being persuasive, because you can see which places are optimized to feel good and which ones are structured to keep functioning when feeling good stops mattering. By now, you should understand the trap, even if you don't like where it points. The states that keep functioning are not misunderstood paradises. They are not hidden gems. They are environments that charge their residents continuously. Survival there is not dramatic. It is expensive in quiet, cumulative ways that never stop. That cost is precisely why most people reject them while they still have a choice. These places are not optimized for pleasure, convenience, or speed. They are optimized for endurance without asking permission. They survive because they demand payment up front, slowly, daily, and without apology. There is no emergency surcharge. The cost is constant. And constant costs filter people more effectively than any policy ever could. Here is the next binary you can't negotiate with. Comfort versus continuity. Comfort is smoothness. Continuity is persistence. Comfort removes friction until systems must absorb it for you. Continuity leaves friction in place, so systems don't have to. When external systems fail, the difference becomes visible immediately. Most people design their lives around frictionless living. Short commutes, reliable services, instant delivery, infinite choice. This lifestyle works only because massive, invisible systems absorb complexity on your behalf. When those systems degrade, the friction doesn't disappear. It rebounds. And when it rebounds, it does so all at once. Cold is the first tax these environments impose. Cold doesn't negotiate. It punishes delay. It exposes laziness without drama. Heating, insulation, fuel access, timing, these are not lifestyle choices. They are survival variables. Miss one, and the environment responds immediately, not violently, just conclusively. States that remain functional train people psychologically through climate long before collapse arrives. You learn to plan because not planning hurts. You learn to respect timing because mistiming has consequences. That conditioning matters when everything else destabilizes, because people already operate inside constraints instead of resenting them. Distance is the second tax, and it is less forgiving. Remote places do not correct mistakes quickly. Missed shipments don't reappear tomorrow. Medical access is thinner. Services are slower. Help exists, but it is not immediate. This forces behavioral adaptation. People learn to solve problems locally because escalation is uncertain. This rewires expectations. You stop assuming backup will arrive on schedule. You stop externalizing responsibility. You become precise, not because you want to be resilient, but because imprecision is punished. Over time, this creates populations that function without constant reassurance from systems they don't control. The third cost is invisibility. States that survive are rarely culturally central. They don't dominate media cycles. They aren't sold as futures. They don't attract endless inflows of people chasing opportunity or identity. That lack of attention reduces load. And load is what breaks systems faster than physical damage ever could. Here's what nobody tells you plainly. Survival environments train you long before collapse begins. People raised in high-friction regions already live inside limits. They track seasons. They budget fuel. They understand downtime. When systems wobble, their behavior doesn't collapse because it was never built on uninterrupted abundance. Most people can't tolerate that trade. They want resilience without sacrifice, safety without inconvenience, survival without discomfort. That combination doesn't exist in reality. It only exists in marketing language and political promises, both of which disappear early in collapse. The states that keep working extract payment daily, not during emergencies. And that steady, unglamorous cost is exactly why fewer people choose them voluntarily, until choice disappears. At that point, the price doesn't go down, it just becomes unavoidable. This is where people make their final strategic error, and they make it calmly. They assume movement remains available as an option after collapse begins. They tell themselves they will wait for clarity, then relocate decisively. That assumption feels rational. It is also fatal. Mobility is not a constant. It is a condition that degrades faster than almost anything else once systems fall out of sync. Here is the binary you cannot negotiate with. Early positioning versus reactive movement. Early positioning happens while systems still tolerate inefficiency. Reactive movement happens when those systems are already stressed. The difference is not distance, it is load. Movement under stress does not disperse people, it compresses them. Migration during instability is not relocation, it is convergence. Roads stop being infrastructure and start being funnels. Fuel stops being a commodity and becomes leverage. Information stops being guidance and becomes rumor. Each mile traveled adds variables you no longer control, and variables compound faster than risk intuition can track. You do not outrun collapse. You collide with everyone else attempting the same correction at the same time. That collision is not cinematic. It is slow, bureaucratic, and exhausting. Lines form, delays stretch, decisions become reactive, and every delay feeds the next one. States that survive do so partly because they resist influx, not politically, but structurally. Distance, climate, limited housing, and low service density all slow population spikes. These factors are not walls, they are filters. Filters do not stop movement completely, they reduce velocity. Reduced velocity preserves system coherence. Filters preserve function because systems fail at thresholds, not gradually. A water system can handle steady demand. It fails when demand spikes suddenly. The same is true for waste, healthcare, power, and food distribution. Migration spikes create step changes that infrastructure cannot absorb without time. When people flood into fragile systems, even resilient infrastructure destabilizes. Water usage jumps before supply can adjust. Waste systems overload quietly. Emergency rooms saturate without warning. Social trust erodes as unfamiliar volume replaces predictability. The system doesn't break because of outsiders. It breaks because scale changes faster than adaptation. This is where people die waiting. Not violently, passively. They wait for confirmation that moving is justified. They wait for official signals. They wait for the moment when leaving feels responsible instead of premature. By the time that feeling arrives, movement has already become hazardous. Not because of chaos or conflict, but because logistics do not scale on demand. Fuel distribution favors existing patterns. Medical systems prioritize known populations. Supply contracts assume stable geography. When movement deviates from those assumptions, support thins without announcing it has done so. Local networks respond the same way. Not out of hostility, but out of compression. Familiar faces get priority because trust reduces coordination cost. Unknowns require verification. Verification takes time. Time is what disappears first. What feels like exclusion is often just triage under load. Here's what nobody tells you clearly. Collapse rewards those who are already boringly in place, not adaptable movers, not bold relocators, but people whose geography already matches system decay. They don't win because they act. They win because they don't need to. Late movers are not punished morally. They are punished mathematically. Every additional dependency, fuel stops, restocking points, navigation assumptions, weather windows, adds failure points. Failure points don't announce themselves individually. They cascade when timing slips just enough. Survival geography only works if you are already aligned with it. Trying to reach it under stress usually increases exposure instead of reducing it. This isn't fear-based thinking. It's sequencing. And in collapse, sequencing decides outcomes long before intentions matter. This is not about bravery. It is about timing. And timing is everything. By now, the pattern should feel uncomfortable, not because it is dramatic, but because it removes excuses. Once you see how survival actually works, you can't hide behind motivation, preparedness, or belief. The system doesn't care how serious you are. It only responds to structure. Survival is not about toughness, intelligence, or readiness. Those traits matter only after geography and infrastructure have already decided how much time you're allowed. What actually matters is structural alignment. You either live where systems decay slowly enough for adaptation to happen, or you live where failure accelerates faster than decision-making. This is the final binary you don't get to avoid. Decision versus drift. Decision is deliberate positioning. Drift is allowing momentum to choose for you. Drift feels neutral. It isn't. It is a silent commitment to whatever failure curve your environment is already on. Most people drift because drifting is comfortable. Careers pull them. Housing markets trap them. Social gravity keeps them in place. In stable eras, this works. Systems absorb the consequences of inattention. In unstable eras, drifting becomes a liability that compounds quietly until movement is no longer an option. The states that keep functioning don't do so because they are immune to collapse. None are. They function because their degradation rate is slow enough for human adaptation to matter. That is the only advantage that counts. A system that fails slowly can be worked around. A system that fails fast erases choice. No state survives everything. That idea is fantasy. Some states simply fail later in smaller increments with more warning. That delay creates thinking space. And thinking space is survival currency. Time is the only non-renewable resource in collapse. You can lose money and recover. You can lose comfort and adapt. You cannot recover lost decision windows. Once coordination collapses below a certain threshold, options don't disappear dramatically. They evaporate quietly. This is why fantasies about stockpiles and heroics are dangerous. They assume execution under stress will be clean. It won't be. Plans that rely on precision fail first. Survival doesn't care about your intent or effort. It responds to load, flow, and friction. Always has. You don't need a checklist because checklists assume stable execution environments. Collapse is defined by unstable execution. What you need is clarity. Clarity about what your life depends on every day and how many systems must cooperate for that normalcy to exist. Map where your water comes from, not the faucet, the source. How far it travels, how many systems touch it, how many jurisdictions control it. Water that crosses fewer boundaries fails later. Map where your energy originates, not the outlet, the generation. Local production, regional distribution, or long transmission chains. Energy that requires fewer synchronized actors persists longer. Map how many systems must cooperate for your day to remain normal. Transportation, data, fuel, staffing, timing. Each dependency is a potential point of collapse. Count them honestly, without optimism. Then ask one question, without bargaining. If coordination fails, does this place still work? Not perfectly. Not comfortably, just enough to function. If the answer is no, then drifting is not neutral. It is a choice you've already made. This is where most people stop thinking. They don't want the answer because answers demand decisions. Decisions create friction with the life they've built. Drift feels easier. Until it isn't. Decide now. Not where you want to live, not what feels right. Decide where failure slows down enough for you to think, adapt, and reposition when systems start shedding coordination. Memorize the pattern. Not the states, not the names, the pattern. Because when collapse becomes obvious, geography stops being a topic for discussion and becomes a verdict you can't outsource to anyone else.